The cabin in the mountains had always been our refuge. Tucked among tall pines, overlooking a stretch of still water that mirrored the sky, it was more than a getaway. It was a sanctuary. My wife and I had chosen it because of its isolation. No neighbors close enough to pry, no subdivision rules, no committees. Just silence, wildlife, and the freedom of land we owned outright. That freedom, however, was precisely what drew the attention of the wrong kind of neighbor. A homeowners association governed the nearest subdivision at the base of the hill. Technically, their reach stopped well short of our land. Our cabin, our driveway, our property, all were outside their domain. Yet, in the mind of one woman, none of that mattered. She was the HOA president. People called her Karen, and it wasn't a nickname chosen lightly. She was notorious for staking claims, issuing threats, and acting as though every pine needle in the county fell under her watch. The subdivision homeowners obeyed her not because they wanted to, but because they were too worn down to resist. When Karen saw us arrive at the cabin that weekend, her curiosity sharpened into suspicion. My wife was carrying several long gun cases from the truck into the cabin. Nothing unusual for us. We hunted in season, we trained at ranges, and we always kept firearms secured responsibly. Out here, far from city lights, wildlife was a real concern, and protection was simply common sense. To Karen, though, the sight of rifles being carried into the cabin was a scandal waiting to unfold. She wasn't content to mind her own business. Instead, she took out her phone, dialed, and began setting into motion what she thought would be her ultimate act of control. We didn't know it at the time. Inside the cabin, we unpacked our gear, loaded the pantry with food, and settled into the rhythm we loved. Quiet evenings by the fire, mornings with coffee on the deck, afternoons spent fishing on the lake. Life slowed down here and we embraced it. But down the hill, the storm was building. Karen called the police, reporting that armed individuals were transporting weapons into a cabin on community property. The irony of her words was staggering. Our land was not community property. It was not even remotely under HOA control. Yet the way she told it, she framed us as dangerous outsiders, intruders who needed to be removed. When the patrol cars rolled up our driveway, their lights flashing across the timber walls of the cabin, we felt a familiar frustration settle in. This wasn't the first time Karen had tried to push boundaries, but this time was different. The stakes were higher. The sight of uniformed officers stepping out of their vehicles, hands hovering near their belts, told us she had exaggerated her claims to the point of alarm. The officers asked questions, scanned the area, and looked uneasy when they saw the cases stacked inside by the wall. My wife calmly explained, pointing to the paperwork, permits, and the clear legality of everything we owned. The officers weren't hostile. They were cautious, perhaps embarrassed to be there on such a flimsy call. Then came the turn Karen hadn't expected. The officers radioed in, and within minutes, unmarked vehicles began arriving. Not local police this time. Federal agents. The HOA president had unwittingly triggered a flag when she mentioned large quantities of firearms. The information had been passed along, and the FBI had taken notice. Karen stood at the end of the driveway, watching, arms crossed, ready to bask in what she thought was her triumph. She had called in reinforcements to rid herself of the neighbors she despised. But when the agents stepped out, showed their credentials, and began speaking not to us but to her, the smugness drained from her face. The FBI had questions, but not for us. They quickly saw that our documents were in order, our property ownership was clear, and our firearms were legally possessed. What they didn't understand was why a local HOA president had made such a bold, misleading report. Karen tried to speak, her voice trembling now, insisting she had been protecting the community. But the more she spoke, the more tangled her lies became. Inside the cabin, my wife and I exchanged a look. What was meant to be a peaceful weekend had turned into a spectacle. Yet there was a grim satisfaction in watching Karen stumble. For once, her tactics hadn't cornered her victims, they had cornered her. That night, as the vehicles finally departed and the forest returned to its quiet, we sat on the porch with a glow of lantern light casting shadows across the deck. The air was cool, the lake shimmered under the moon, and the chaos felt far away again. But we knew it wasn't over. Karen had overplayed her hand, and though she had been shaken, she wasn't the type to admit defeat. She would twist the story, claim misunderstanding, and rally her HOA followers once more. If anything, the involvement of federal agents had only deepened her resentment. The cabin was ours. The land was ours. The guns were legal. But Karen wasn't finished. She had drawn lines in her mind, and in her mind the war had just begun. Karen had been rattled by the FBI's sudden appearance at the cabin. For someone used to commanding her subdivision with intimidation, it was the first time the tables had turned on her. Standing in the gravel driveway with agents questioning her, she had looked less like a leader and more like a schoolyard bully caught red-handed. But embarrassment does not always bring humility. For Karen it brought anger. And anger fueled her determination. By the following week, her version of the story began to spread. She gathered HOA board members in her living room, served refreshments, and launched into her performance. She described herself as a courageous defender of the community, someone who had bravely reported suspicious activity, and endured a misunderstanding with federal agents. The truth that she had lied about ownership, exaggerated threats, and wasted everyone's time, was buried under layers of self-serving spin. And the board members listened. Some out of habit, others because they didn't want to cross her. Karen framed the cabin as a danger to the subdivision, claiming that armed outsiders living above their homes could not be trusted. She painted herself as the only barrier between the community and supposed lawlessness. Within days, flyers began appearing again. They warned residents about increased risks from the armed couple on the hill. Some claimed the FBI visit had confirmed suspicions, when in fact it had cleared them. Fear spread through the neighborhood and Karen fed on it. She turned the cabin into a villainous symbol, and herself into the heroine. Meanwhile, life at the cabin continued as normal, or at least as normal as it could under the circumstances. My wife and I went about our routines, careful, watchful, aware that eyes from below were fixed on us. We noticed more cars than usual lingering near the base of our driveway, drivers slowing down to look. The whispers and glances followed us even when we went into town. Karen's reach was stretching beyond the subdivision. Then came the letters. Official-looking envelopes with HOA letterhead, slipped under our gate, demanding that we attend a safety compliance hearing. The language was crafted to sound legal, to intimidate. But they had no authority over us. Our property was outside their control. We knew it and so did they. Still the persistence wore on us. Every envelope, every flyer, every knock on the door reminded us that Karen's obsession wasn't fading. It was growing. The boldest move yet came one Saturday morning. As mist curled off the lake and the sun broke through the trees, we discovered a group of residents had gathered at the water's edge. Coolers, chairs, fishing rods. They were acting as though the lake was theirs, invited by the HOA. When I approached and explained the truth, that the lake was private, they shifted uncomfortably. Most left quickly, muttering apologies. But a few resisted, insisting that the HOA president told us it was community property. That was Karen's strategy in full view. If she couldn't take the land through legal means, she would do it by perception. If enough people behaved as though the lake was theirs, it would muddy the waters of truth. Ownership could be eroded by lies if the lies spread wide enough. We documented everything. Photos, videos, witness accounts. The more Karen pushed, the more evidence stacked up. Yet the pressure was real. What was supposed to be a quiet retreat had become a constant siege. And then, just when it seemed her campaign had plateaued, Karen made another mistake. She called the police again. This time, she claimed we were brandishing weapons at lake visitors. The officers arrived, tense, only to discover the truth. Rifles locked safely inside, no threats made, nothing illegal occurring. But here's the twist. Because she had escalated the accusations so recklessly, the officers filed a report. Not against us but against Karen. False reporting, harassment, and misuse of emergency services were all being noted. For the first time, an official record of her behavior was taking shape. Word began to spread in the subdivision. Not everyone believed her anymore. Some residents started asking questions, realizing the story she told didn't match the reality. Cracks appeared in her grip over the HOA. That evening, as we sat by the fire in the cabin, my wife remarked on the shift. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. Maybe Karen's empire of control was starting to crumble under the weight of her own lies. But deep down I knew better. People like her don't surrender easily. If anything, being challenged only made her more dangerous. The hill and the cabin were still ours. The FBI had already cleared us. The police were beginning to see through her games. But Karen wasn't finished. She had tasted the sting of near defeat, and in her mind, that only meant she needed to strike harder next time. And that's where things stood. Karen twisting the truth, painting herself as a victim, and pushing her neighbors to believe her lies. The police were starting to see her for what she really was, but her influence hadn't disappeared yet. So what do you think? Is this justice finally catching up to her? Or is she still getting away with too much? Share your thoughts below, because in Chapter 3, Karen takes her fight to an entirely new level.